She went from being a random superhero to a creature of myth, and she ended up being the romantic interest of one of the turtles, despite the wishes of one of the turtles' co-creators. Today, in the Turtle Nexus, I will explore the story of Radical and her nemesis, Complete Carnage. Radical was a creation of Kevin Eastman for a backup story on the second reprint of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles #3 in November of 1988. This story would get later reprinted in 1989 for the Shell Shock special and eventually for the 25th anniversary collection. Although, there is something unusual about the publication of this story. More on that later. Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird were interested in creating a universe where the Turtles could coexist with superheroes. This made sense as they were trying to have more creations than just the Turtles for the Mirage comics. Radical was one of the early superheroes created for this universe. Her origin, as well as other heroes, would be explored in the Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles series. To be honest, Kevin Eastman may have created the character, but it was the work of Jim Lawson, Ryan Brown, Steve Levine, and Michael Dooney in particular that expanded her origin, adding the Native American heritage to her backstory and identity. When Radical was introduced to the readers, she was simply a superhero. The Turtles believed to be a comic book character. It would take years to properly develop her character. This is her actual origin. Radical, whose civilian name was Raven Shadowheart, was the granddaughter of a powerful Algonquian shaman. She lived on sacred grounds, where she met another boy who used to do chores for her grandfather. One day, she noticed the beavers playing there. Her grandfather explained to her that those were no ordinary beavers. They were the children of the great white grandfather beaver. He was honored that they chose that spot. Excited about it, she told the boy, who, probably in disbelief, picked a stone and threw it at the beaver. She prevented the rock from hitting the beaver, but then she thought she saw a giant beaver ghost. After that, the boy disappeared, and she never crossed paths with him again. Raven didn't realize at the time that she and the boy's fate were changed forever by the Great Beaver. According to the myth, the Great Beaver was at the base of a huge pole that held the world, and every time the beaver got angry, it would gnaw at the pole. So it was crucial not to make the beaver angry, because the fall of that pole would be the end of the world. Years later, a lightning bolt struck both Raven and a construction worker. While Raven gained the powers of liquid energy, lightning, and thunder, the construction worker would be wholly deformed, becoming Complete Carnage. It turned out that his powers came from dark and evil places, from Bakthal and Unkethi, while her powers were given by the rain and the natural world. Now going by the name of Radical, Raven also possessed a sensing sense that allowed her to find Complete Carnage. The two immediately became enemies, and they didn't understand why. In one of these encounters, she tried to eliminate him by throwing him strongly enough to make him end up at the North Pole. But Carnage bounced from a plane and ended up in the Temple of the Holy Order of the Zen Taoists in Upper New York State. They thought he was a prophet foretold in their Bible, the Zenosopher. They trained him in martial arts and Eastern philosophy to prepare him for the modern world. But one day, they discovered he could meld or absorb man-made construction materials. He could move through materials and absorb energy from their mass. When he was experienced enough in using his powers, he absorbed energy from the mass of the temple, destroying it as a result. He then returned to New York, where the unlimited source of manufactured materials would guarantee his revenge against Radical. This is the starting point of Radical's second appearance in Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Volume 1, Number 5, in May of 1988. If you've been paying attention, that means that Radical's first appearance came out 6 months after her second appearance. Since that story is referenced in this issue, it wouldn't be crazy to assume that the story was created for a different publication before it was first printed. But I digress. Complete Carnage found Raven while she was biking, and the two started fighting right in front of April's van. The Turtles tried to help Radical, but she was taken by Complete Carnage. Complete Carnage placed Radical into a trap, planning on burying her in cement and perhaps absorbing her power that way. The Turtles interrupted him and freed Radical. In the fight, she ripped off his arm and escaped to Central Park, away from artificial materials that would allow Complete Carnage to reabsorb his arm. Complete Carnage followed her there, not realizing that he would get weaker away from all the man-made materials. The Turtles tried to help her, but she only saw one way of solving the problem. Without knowing much about it, she used her particle beam ability on him, which apparently pulverized them. The Turtles assumed this was a one-time power and decided to separate the remains, shipping them all over the country, just in case Complete Carnage could come back from the dead. They didn't realize his arm was still intact, and only us readers witnessed it, hitchhiking on the road. I will explain what happened to this arm later in this video. Radical seemed to have died, but both came back to life sometime later at Central Park. Carnage escaped through the tarmac, away from Radical, hoping to regain his power before she could recover and destroy him. This next appearance occurred in Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Volume 1, Number 27, in November 1989. This is the story written and illustrated by Michael Dooney, and the one that actually added the most characterization to Radical and Complete Carnage. The Turtles found out something wasn't right when they all shared a dream about Radical and Complete Carnage. After telling their master about it, he revealed to them he also had symbolic dreams and suggested they find the Buffalo Rock in Massachusetts, near Hadley, to figure out their dream's meaning. When the Turtles found the rock, they also found Radical. She revealed that she wasn't simply a superhero. She worked at the Natural History Museum of New York, and her specialty was in American Indian Studies. After telling Radical about their shared dream, she figured out that her late grandfather connected the Turtles to the dreamscape so that they could help Radical. Raven was at a very powerful spot that made her stronger, so all she needed was to bring Carnage there. But after a short connection with nature, a Thunderbird passed through her. She explained to the Turtles that there were 4 great Thunderbirds, and below them were smaller, less powerful beings. She was chosen to become one of those, making her a mythical creature of sorts. Since she came back to the world, she had been fighting Carnage in the dreamscape, but his power became bigger and bigger over time, making it imperative to put an end to him while she still could. With the help of the Turtles and the Coyote, a trickster being, they set up a trap for Carnage. With a spell, they turned the pavement in the dreamscape into water. Once Carnage was inside, they turned it into rock and finally into water, dissolving Complete Carnage forever, or so it would seem. But not all of Carnage was gone. There was still that missing arm that at some point made it to Chicago, under the possession of the Wayland Freeze Scientific Research Center. When this center was destroyed, the same way Carnage used to destroy buildings, the Turtles realized he was back. Unable to make a proper decision, Raphael went to Chicago to investigate. This story was a crossover between Mirage and Image Comics, published in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle / Savage Dragon crossover of 1995 and in Savage Dragon number 22. The rest of the Turtles went to the National History Museum in New York to talk to Raven, who was expecting them. For reasons that were very convenient for this crossover, Raven's powers were severely diminished, and she could only use them in the dreamscape. She explained to them that some scientists were able to bring back Carnage through that arm. Still, it was technically a copy of the original. She sent them to Chicago through the dreamscape to help Raphael and Savage Dragon. Keep in mind, this was the second crossover between the two properties, so they already knew each other. It is also worth pointing out, the story was half published by Mirage Studios, so it should be canon, but more on that later. The rest of the story was a big fight that ended with Carnage falling into the lake and then getting drowned by a Savage Dragon villain named Fiend. For no other reason but to make Savage Dragon think he killed him. Let me know if this made any sense to you in the comics. Who would have thought Carnage could die by lack of air? It would become clear that every writer had a different interpretation of the power set of Radical and Complete Carnage in their last story. Swan Song was published in 2007 in Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Volume 2, Number 41, written by Steve Murphy. This story took place in the future of the Mirage timeline and was centered on Leonardo. It was inspired by an unrelated event in the main title, but more on that later. The story took place after the events of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Volume 4. Leonardo visited Raven in the Southwest, at her ancestral homeland. Leonardo gained spiritual awareness there, and the two fell into something deeper than love. It was transcendence. Sex was somehow implied. After traveling through the country, they returned to New York. But once they stepped into man-made materials, Radical's sensing sense detected the presence of Complete Carnage. He took her by surprise and snapped her neck. Leonardo was devastated, and all he wanted now was revenge. But it would take him several years to find Complete Carnage in a hostage situation in Hong Kong. When he faced him, he decided to forgive him and rescue the hostages. But Complete Carnage wasn't interested in his forgiveness and killed one of the hostages. Leonardo was infuriated and sliced him in half. This somehow was the last death of Complete Carnage, even though it was already established that he couldn't die that way. Leonardo felt guilty about killing again and decided to abandon the way of the warrior and went back to nature to live the rest of his final days. As I mentioned before, the events of Swan Song were inspired by some events in the main title. Radical made a microscopic appearance when the Utroms arrived on Earth on a diplomatic mission, with the full extent of her powers. When Splinter died, Leonardo messaged her, and she attended the funeral. It was implied in that issue that the two had a special relationship. When asked by readers, Peter Laird promised that the story would be told in the Tales of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles book. That was the story written by Steve Murphy in 2007. In 2013, while answering questions from fans, Peter admitted that, despite being the one approving all the stories for the sister title, he never read the premise of Swan Song and never even read the issue. However, he clarified that he was never a fan of turtle-human relationships, making it clear that it wasn't what he originally had in mind for the two characters. Furthermore, it would seem that most of the stories from the future of the Mirage timeline weren't in the orbit of Peter Laird either, but that is a story for a different video. Radical only made one appearance in licensed media outside of the comics. She was used in the Trans-Dimensional Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles RPG game, published by Palladium Books in 1989. In that book, she was given a different identity. Her name was Hazel McIntyre, and she was a spoiled and narcissistic child. She dropped out of school, got married, and then divorced before she turned 22. But this story is non-canonical. And speaking of canon, the canonicity of the second Savage Dragon crossover is also in question. The reason behind her diminished powers in that story was never mentioned again, and despite being published by Mirage, it could have been bundled with the rest of the stories that included Image Comics characters, in which case it wouldn't be canon. But there is no way of knowing for sure. The myth of the Great Beaver was also quite puzzling for researchers. This real-life myth of the Algonquian tribes led many paleontologists to believe it could have been not about a giant beaver, but a Pleistocene creature called Castaroides ohioensis, a long-extinct rodent that used to live in North America and whose fossils were probably discovered by the Algonquian tribes. So, are the future Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles stories canon if they were never approved by Peter Laird? I would have to say yes, as they were all written by the writers of the same canon stories. But at the time, the 30th anniversary special may have implied that the future could have been prevented after all. What do you think? Is the story in Swansong canon? And do you think Radical was a good match for Leonardo? Leave your comments below. And since you're at it, did you know that whenever someone clicks on the like button, a beaver smiles? Think about that before you leave this video. Thanks for watching.